I think the two main strengths of the book are firstly the enormous amount of new material, especially from the Russian archives, but from many others, but above all from the Russian archives, which it contains. And secondly, the fact that if you look at the international crisis of the early 20th century from a Russian and East European perspective, simply you get a completely different First World War and international crisis than if you look at it from the perspective of London and Paris, or even of Berlin. And it seems to be not merely a different perspective, but a more real one, because this was an East European war. And although the First World War is in the end won on the Western Front in military terms, the peace of 1919 is lost in the East, because a war which was above all between Russia and the Germanic powers of Central Europe ended up with the destruction of all three empires. And the Peace of Versailles is made against Germany and Russia and without Germany and Russia. And that makes a Second World War almost inevitable. And it's not a coincidence at all that that Second World War began in Eastern Europe at Danzig. As to the questions involved in the book and in the whole crisis, I would say a number of things. Firstly, that without the war, the Bolsheviks might have come to power in Russia, but they would not have held power, for a number of reasons. But above all, because European intervention in peacetime would have been far more effective and far more devastating than was the case in 1917 to 20. It's, a complete illusion to imagine that the European great powers in peacetime will allow Russia to secede from the international system and set itself up as the headquarters of international socialist revolution, let alone to expropriate vast amounts of foreign debt. And the Germans in particular will never in peacetime allow the German communities in Russia, and particularly the German elites in the Baltic provinces, to be destroyed. In peacetime you would have had a European intervention headed by the German army, and it would have succeeded, almost certainly. If you see what happened in 1917 to 20, or 17 to 18 anyway, the Germans, far from supporting the cause of counter-revolution in Russia, play a huge role in encouraging, supporting and developing the revolution. Lenin would not have returned to Russia without the Germans. So, I think in that sense the war is crucial in changing the whole aspect of the Russian Revolution. More broadly, it seems to me that, if one's talking about Russia and Russian policy is a question of security, of interests, and of identity. Security means fear of German power, and the alliances with France and Britain in the name of the European balance of power. Interests means the desire to control the Straits, and identity is partly Russia's identity as a Slav, the leader of the Slav people, and of identity simply as being a great power and empire. And I think the key there is that in all these ways Russia is not exceptional or exotic. In fact, the foundations of its policy are very similar to the foundations of policy and the ideas which lurk beneath them in London or Paris or anywhere among the great powers. So in that sense, I'm attempting to put the Russian example into a European context. After all, let's say if one looks at the question of Constantinople and the Straits, where clearly Russia does have expansionist ambitions, and these are destabilizing. You have to, on the other hand, remember that the British have taken Suez and the whole of Egypt as a result, and the Americans have annexed a large slice of Central America to control and create their Panama Canal. And yet the Panama Canal and Suez are a good deal less important for the British and Americans than the Straits are for Russia. For whose economic development it's absolutely essential. There's no alternative means to get Russian exports out. So it's an attempt in that sense to balance, an interpretation of Russia with a broader interpretation of how other great powers operate. But the second and crucial point, as I say, is also to remember that one has to understand the international context and the international comparisons, and doing so from a Russian perspective is, I think, enormously useful. And for me, the war is really about the crisis of empire and nationalisms. And although in the immediate sense it's the Germans and Austrians who are certainly responsible for launching the crisis of July 1914 and bringing on a world war, in some ways I see the Suez Crisis, for instance, in 1956 as the British and French equivalent of Austria in 1914. In other words, you have the rulers of empire responding to geopolitical decline and nationalist challenges with the same sort of mixture of desperation, arrogance and miscalculation that the Austrians show in 14. And the main difference is that whereas the elder brother in Washington says no in 56, elder brother in Berlin in 14 doesn't just say yes, it pushes, the Austrians forward. So I think all of these elements come out of the book, as do many other things. I think a key issue to remember, though, is that in 1914 most European statesmen and generals, though they may have recognised the enormous risks in a European war, did think that war could be won, and they had good historical reasons for believing that. So that's another thing I try and look at in the book. I think it's also worth pointing out that the Germans very nearly did win the First World War, and would have done it had they not brought the Americans into the war at the very moment that the Russian Revolution was taking Russia out. Because without the Americans and without the Russians, the French and British could never have defeated Germany. The Germans probably couldn't have defeated the French and British on the Western Front, but they didn't need to. All they needed was a stalemate in the West and victory in the East, and that was within their power. If they could have maintained the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in the East, they would have won the First World War. And the great tragedy is that although the intervention of the Americans ends up with Allied victory on the Western Front, the peace which is created by that victory is terribly unstable. The Americans go home. The British also retreat from the continent of Europe. The French can't maintain the European settlement on their own. Above all because Versailles is created against Germany and Russia and without Germany and Russia. And you can't have a stable European settlement against the two most powerful countries in Europe. So the most, tragic, longer-term consequence of the First World War is the Second World War, made almost inevitable by the way that the First World War ended. And for the Russians themselves, the great tragedy is that the 2 million Russians who died in the First World War died for nothing, and that Russia needed to fight the First World War all over again in 1941 to 45.